Thanks for joining us for this archive of Teaching American History and Ashbrook's special webinar for July 15th, 2020. The focus of today's program was the American Revolution and Dr. Rob Mcdonald's outstanding core documents collection reader about the same. Dr. Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center and Professor of Political Science at Ashland University, interviewed Dr. Rob Mcdonald of the United States Military Academy about the American Revolution as a political, social, and historical event, and made mention of a number of the documents in the volume. You can download a free PDF copy of the volume at tah.org/collections or purchase a physical copy from tah.org/bookstore. Thanks for listening.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center. So glad you could join us for this special webinar today for our Directors Club members. We want to welcome you. Glad that you're here with us. Thanks for joining us. This is a special webinar on a really important and timely topic. It comes out of Professor Rob Mcdonald's book that he is doing for the Ashbrook Center and we have now published on the American Revolution. But boy, what an important topic for this time in our country's life. So we want to spend some time today talking with Professor Mcdonald about this really important book and important and timely topic. And again, I want to thank you for joining us. We'll spend the next 50 minutes or so having a conversation about this fundamental question of the meaning and significance of the American Revolution. And we really think of this webinar, even though it's special for our Directors Club members, we really think of it as part of the overall mission of the Ashbrook Center, which, as you who are supporters know, is to strengthen constitutional self-government by educating our fellow Americans in the history and principles of our country and the habits necessary for self-government. And I think when we look around the world today and we look around our country today, I think we see how important that mission is. More important now, I would say, than ever before, which is why I'm so glad that you're joining us for this. As you know, at Ashbrook, we think of education as not information simply, and definitely not indoctrination. We don't have a fashionable view of it. We have a sort of old-fashioned view, which is that education is really about thinking, and above all about discovery, discovering the truth for yourself. And we structure all our programs for students, for teachers, for citizens around that fundamental idea. As Thomas Jefferson said, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, that the human mind is free and that it can pursue the truth and it can understand the truth, and that America is a free country founded on principles of freedom. And so we think of education as part of that larger understanding of freedom, the freedom to think, the freedom to explore, the freedom to discover the truth for yourself. And we do that, as you know, this Ashbrook way of teaching and learning through conversation. Conversation rooted in primary historical documents, the kind of documents that we see put together so wonderfully by Professor Mcdonald in his book on the American Revolution. Those documents speak to us. We can ask them questions. They can give us answers that are still timely, important, and interesting. That's why we're putting together this set. Professor Mcdonald's book on the American Revolution is one of a set. When it's completed, it'll be a 45-volume, complete set of primary source documents for American history and government. It will really allow students and teachers and citizens to replace textbooks, which are so often biased or boring, or sometimes both, to replace those with the fundamental primary documents of our history, and to engage in those kind of conversations around the enduring questions of America. So that's why we think this volume is so important, and this project of our core documents curriculum is so vital to the mission of the Ashbrook Center. We're not going to just talk about the documents, of course. We're going to talk with the documents in a certain way, with the authors, to try and understand them as they understood themselves, and to try and learn something. It's a fundamental principle of Ashbrook's programs that we can learn from history. that we can learn insights from the past that help us understand contemporary issues more fully. And I think the American Revolution is a great example, and the disputes over it, even today, are an example of how we can learn from history to think about the present more effectively, but also to renew our own understanding of the principles of America and what they mean. So we really do believe in the power of history for learning, for insight. We believe in the old Greek understanding of history as inquiry, asking the past questions and listening to what the past has to say to us today and the insights that it gives us. We're going to be doing that, as I said, with Professor Rob Mcdonald. Rob is an old friend of the Ashbrook Center and of our teaching programs. He is professor of history at the United States Military Academy at West Point. So he is teaching the future military leaders of this country the meaning of America and its history. His bachelor degree is from the University of Virginia, a fellow Wahoo. Mine is too. Glad to have that connection, Rob. His master's degree has two of them. One from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm not sure how a person from Virginia goes to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, but we'll leave it at that. Bit of a rivalry there. But a wonderful place to study American history, UNC Chapel Hill. And then, of course, he went on to Oxford to get Oxford University in England to get another master's degree, and then came back to the United States to get his doctorate, his PhD, again from the University of North Carolina. Rob is also, besides being a professor at West Point, also distinguished graduate faculty in Ashbrook's Master of Arts in American History and Government program, and also in our Teaching American History programs for teachers. So Rob has been one of the most active and vital faculty members for Ashbrook. I want to thank him for that. I really do thank you, Rob, for your participation. He teaches American Revolution class for us. He teaches the Early Republic for us, and he's published a number of important works in those areas. He's published a lot of articles, and I think at least 4 books on the American founding, and just a few of them, just to give you a sample of the breadth and depth of his learning. He's published one, Thomas Jefferson's Military Academy, Founding West Point, appropriate for a person teaching at West Point. Another one, an important book called Sons of the Father, George Washington and His Proteges. And then one of his more recent books is called Confounding Father, Thomas Jefferson's Image in His Own Time. You can see again the depth of his understanding, his knowledge, and we're just so delighted, Rob, that you could be with us today to share a little bit about the American Revolution volume and about the important question of the meaning and significance of the American Revolution. And I thought maybe to get us started off, you sent me a wonderful note a week or two ago, and I just thought for our folks listening, you might recount that. It was a great story you told about teaching a class with teachers on the early Republic, I think, and the effect that had on the teachers. And I thought just might be great for our supporters here to have you tell that story to them, because I think it illustrates so wonderfully what we're hoping to accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. And first of all, thank you so much for having me on. And thanks also for the invitation to put together the American Revolution Core Documents volume. I mean, it was probably the most enjoyable project on which I've ever worked, and I learned a whole lot from it. So it was a really great experience. But another great experience was teaching the Early Republic course for Ashland up until about 2 weeks ago. It was originally going to be in person at Ashland, but because of coronavirus, of course, it was moved online and it became a 2-week course. So I spent 2 weeks, about 3 hours a day with all of these different teachers. And they were a really strong group, a really remarkable group. And despite the fact that we were meeting with each other virtually, we did kind of bond and get to know each other over the course of the 2 weeks. And as we began to wrap things up, I spoke about the simultaneous deaths of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson on July 4th, 1826, which was just, an incredible coincidence, if you want to call it that. A lot of people back in 1826 thought it was the hand of Providence at work, that these two, chief draftsmen of the Declaration of Independence, two champions of independence, really the Batman and the Robin of independence in the Continental Congress, that they would die, 50 years later on the same exact day. Jefferson died 50 years to the hour after the ratification of the Declaration of Independence. It's really a moving story. And then I moved on to Jefferson's Epitaph, which he wrote for himself, where he listed as the accomplishments by which he most wanted to be remembered his authorship of the Declaration, his authorship of Virginia's Statute for Religious Freedom, and his status as the father of the University of Virginia, which he created during his retirement years. And we talked a little bit about all the things that he left out. He could have listed being a member of the House of Burgesses or the Continental Congress. He could have listed being governor of Virginia. He could have listed being a member of Congress under the Articles of Confederation. He could have listed being our ambassador to France, our first Secretary of State, our second vice president, or our third president. But he didn't list any of those offices, in part, I think, because what he thought the source of his greatness was not the power that people gave to him, but instead the powers that he restored to mankind. And one of my students sort of raised her hands virtually in this virtual classroom, and she was crying. I mean, she was sobbing because she said, she had been so disturbed by what she had seen on the news and so disturbed by some of the things that people were saying about the founding of the United States, and that this course really, restored her faith in this shared project that we call the United States of America. And then another student raised her hand, and she was having the same reaction. And I managed to hold it together, but I was kind of getting choked up too. So, I mean, for me, that's just the power of these opportunities. And I'm so happy that, these students of ours at Ashland are actually people who are teachers themselves and have, many, many students in their schools. And, the Army calls such things force multipliers. The ripple effects that this program has, I think, are, multiple and long lasting. So thank you for all that you do to make it possible.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You were exploring in that class and in the American Revolution book. It's clear from the book to me that your approach is it's not just a historical account of things or a collection of documents in historical order, but you really seem to be exploring a larger question. Sort of what is the meaning and significance of the American Revolution? But one of the things that took me by surprise when I was reading it and reading your introduction was when the book starts. When we think of the American Revolution, we often think of, the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775, or we think of the Declaration of Independence, of course, in 76, or maybe we think of Battle of Yorktown, 1781. We tend to think of the War for Independence as the American Revolution. But your book actually starts much farther back, way back in 1761, with speeches and writings by James Otis, which is a name that maybe we remember, but maybe we don't, and has maybe largely been forgotten in American history. But why do you start, if you're going to have us think about the American Revolution, why start in 1761?
Well, I guess I sort of took my cue from John Adams, who wrote that the American Revolution began 15 years before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington or Concord. When you trace back the course of the imperial crisis that followed the French and Indian War, there were a number of different actions on the part of the British government that galvanized resistance on the part of the American colonists. And it's probably worth noting that the British, they had a wonderfully successful campaign against the French in the 7 Years' War, as it was known globally, or the French and Indian War, as it was known in America, and with a great deal of assistance from the American colonists. But while they gained an empire in the interior of North America, they lost not only many men, but also they spent a lot of money. And so during the course of the French and Indian War, Great Britain's debt doubled. And as a result, they wanted to increase the amount of revenue that they raised. And one of the first things that they did was try to enforce the laws that they had on the books. And they did this by issuing what they called Writs of Assistance. And essentially, these were, warrantless authority for British imperial officials to enter people's homes, their warehouses, and their ships to try to inventory the contents and make impossible the act of smuggling. But James Otis stood up against this practice, and he advanced what at that time was not a new concept itself, but was a really important and I think really powerful one. And his speech against writs of assistance, he said, "A man's house is his castle." And when you think about what that means, if your house is your castle, if you are the king of your house or the queen of your house, that means that you're sovereign in your house. And it also means that the king or the queen is not the king or the queen in your house. So it's a really powerful idea as far as limiting the scope of government and the reach of government. The king could be king in the public square or on the public road, but in your house, it's your property, it's your castle. And I think this is important not only in terms of expressing colonial views about the limits of the power of government, but incidentally, I think it's also important in understanding how it was that, in a relative sense, and I'll emphasize relative sense, 18th century Americans were an incredibly tolerant people because they understood that if they questioned their neighbors' rights to do as they wished, to worship as they pleased, to operate as they saw fit on their property, that they would also be undermining their own right to do the same. So I thought that beginning with James Otis was an appropriate start.
And it seems like over time, what we get is a kind of developing American mind. That's a phrase I think that Jefferson uses later in his life, in a letter late in life, when he calls the Declaration of Independence an expression of the American mind. But we get this developing American mind, and as you said, John Adams said the American Revolution was not really about the fighting, the war part. It really happened in the minds of the American people before the shooting ever started. Tell us a little bit about that revolution that Adams is talking about in the thinking of the Americans. Because, one of the questions that we always want to stress with our teachers and students is the fundamental question, what does it mean to be an American? And Adams is saying that idea of American really developed in those years.
So I think there are a couple of intellectual movements, transatlantic intellectual movements, that laid the groundwork for this. One, of course, is the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was this wave of questioning and inquiry and the rejection of received knowledge and old conventional wisdom. And it played itself out in a lot of spheres of thought, but in politics as well. And maybe most famously and most importantly for our story, in Great Britain's or England's glorious revolution of 1688, John Locke justified the overthrowing of King James II and his replacement with William and Mary as new monarchs who agreed to work with Parliament and understand their role within the larger British Constitution by pointing out that government was created in the first place to protect individual rights, chiefly to life and liberty and property. So believing that government's role was to protect those rights was a very patriotic English attitude. So that is an important thing to understand. Another important thing to understand is in the American colonies, the rise of this movement, a religious movement called the Great Awakening, which I think really begins in 1739 when George Whitefield comes to America's shores. And he sparks a whole round of religious fervor as well as religious innovation. And you see in the American colonies the rise of insurgent faiths like Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians. And a growing number of Americans come to regard that their government is wrong about religion. All of the American colonies had a government-sanctioned official church. In New England, it was the Congregationalists. Everywhere else, it was the Church of England, with a couple of minor exceptions that we could probably gloss over for the purposes of this conversation. But if you're a Baptist in Virginia, you think that the government's wrong about God. If you're an Anglican in Massachusetts, you think that the government is wrong about God. And if you think that the government is wrong about God, you realize that the government could be wrong about anything. The government could be wrong about everything. So I think that the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening really worked together to cause Americans to question authority. And then when you see the British in the aftermath of the French and Indian War not only pursuing things such as writs of assistance, but also limiting the ability of American colonists to expand westward through things like the Proclamation Line of 1763, and imposing new taxes without their consent and without any representation in Parliament, taxes like the Stamp Act and the Townsend duties. Americans begin to think that the government is not protecting their liberty, but restricting it. They begin to think that the government is not protecting their property, but it's taking it away without their consent. It's reaching into their pockets without asking. And then when the British in 1768 send troops to America, I mean, you have a recipe there for disaster. And, it leads in a pretty straight line to the Boston Massacre of 1770, which I really don't think was a massacre. I think it was a horrible, misunderstanding, an incident that came about as a result of confusion and chaos and pandemonium in March of 1770 when there was a crowd surrounding a British sentry in front of the customs house in Boston. The bells of the churches all started to ring, which in the 18th century was a sign of some sort of public emergency. And of course, the scariest public emergency in a city made of wood was a fire. And someone yelled fire, and one of the soldiers did, and then the rest of them did. And then there were 11 bloody bodies on the ground, 5 of whom would die. But Americans took that as it was illustrated in Paul Revere's engraving of the Bloody Massacre, as he called it. So now the British government was taking Americans' lives. And all of the things that government was supposed to protect, the British government seemed to be aggressing against. And so I think that helps us to understand how these people who were very enthusiastic as British subjects during the French and Indian War, by 1775 and 1776, began to really question whether or not their government was up to the task it had been assigned by the Glorious Revolution.
Yeah, and it strikes me when you look at even some of the early documents again, James Otis speech against the Ritz of Assistance, but then he has a writing in there, the rights of the colonies asserted and proved. The language seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong here, but it seems to me to start to change a bit. It becomes more radical. And you get arguments that used to be things like, well, all we want is our ancient rights of Englishmen protected, and we start to get more language, it seems to me at least, talking about the natural rights of all men and the natural freedoms of all men. And by the time you get to the early 1770s, the American mind in some ways seems to have, I don't want to, is it fair to say it's departed from the British mind and we have formed this new understanding? Or how do you think about that? Because it seems like the Americans are getting more and more radical in their thinking when they confront the British acts that you're talking about.
I think that's very true. I mean, over the course of this period, you see the evolution of arguments. James Otis, Sam Adams, others were viewed by some, probably in the 1760s, as conspiracy theorists. Who are these guys saying that our good and benevolent and benign British government is going to try to take away our liberties? And after all, and to their credit, the British repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. They repealed the Townsend duties in 1770. So they weren't driving a hard line in the early years of this imperial crisis. But as events unfolded and as the situation developed, and as these singular incidents of the British government trampling upon their rights became a pattern, or as Jefferson would describe it in the Declaration of Independence, a long train of abuses and usurpations, the Americans began to think that there really was a plot, a conspiracy to deny them of rights that they had once considered to be their English liberties, but that now they began to defend as inalienable rights that were possessed by all of mankind.
And I think that John Adams miniseries, the book taken from the book by David McCullough, I think it's wonderful. I love that. I know there are some historical moments in there that might not be fully accurate to a historian like yourself, but I think it's great. And one of the moments that always struck me was at the end of the trial for the Boston Massacre, which John Adams, in fact, right, is the lawyer for the British troops.
That's right. Yeah.
John Adams will later go on to argue so strongly for independence from Britain. He's the lawyer. In the end, he's successful, and the trial's over. And at the end of the trial, everyone in the courtroom has to stand up and say, "God save the king." and the camera flashes over to Samuel Adams, and he's the only one in the room who doesn't say it. And I've often wondered if it was moments like that you thought, there's the first act of the American Revolution.
Maybe so. I mean, it's really interesting when you look at the attitudes that Americans had about the king. They really did want to believe that he was on their side. And, there's a wonderful book that appeared in the early 1970s by the late, great MIT historian Pauline Maier called From Resistance to Revolution. And Americans at first thought that maybe it was just a few bad apples in Parliament who had hijacked things and were trotting upon their rights. And then they began to believe that, no, maybe it was the ruling party in Parliament. And then they began to think that, no, maybe all of Parliament was corrupt or corrupted. But the king, they always held out hope. George III would come to see things as they saw them. And by the time you get to the years after the Boston Tea Party, in which the British passed a set of laws that they called the Coercive Acts and that we called the Intolerable Acts. These are the ones that not only shut down Boston Harbor, but in Massachusetts, they suspend town meetings and the legislature is not allowed to meet for most purposes. And jury trials are curtailed. And they really begin to see their rights flickering away. And people like Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, he wrote a pamphlet called The Summary View of the Rights of British America, where he made the argument that essentially America colonized itself, that the first English settlers here arrived to a state of nature, a wilderness that was, claimed by no government, and that they, created it. He wrote, for themselves they fought, for themselves they conquered, for themselves alone they have right to hold. And voluntarily given their loyalty to the king, insinuating that if that loyalty had been voluntarily extended, it could be voluntarily withdrawn. And you see during the first and second Continental Congresses, people trying to reach out to George III, trying to extend an olive branch that he would grab onto that would allow this situation to become, diffused. And yet the king never did. He didn't recognize the legitimacy of this extra legal body called the Continental Congress. And ultimately, the British had turned, these conspiracy theorists, Sam Adams and James Otis, into prophets by marching their troops out of Boston, across the Charles River, and then to Lexington and Concord to try to seize their arms and ammunition. And Americans at that point really became convinced that this government, which we once had thought was this government that was a great defender of our liberty, is now our freedom's greatest threat.
And I was really struck by the story in there of a guy who I hadn't heard of before. When you're talking about the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the sort of first shots of the Revolution, a guy named Samuel Whitmore. Tell us a little bit about him, because sometimes when we think about the American Revolution, of course, we rightly think of the big names, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. We don't always think about the ordinary Americans without whom none of this happens. But this is one of the first early fights of the war. Who is this guy, Samuel Whitmore, and why is he got this place in your book?
I love the story of Samuel Whitmore, and I love it in part because he illustrates a fact that I think all of us would understand and agree with. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And Samuel Whitmore, at the time of Lexington and Concord in 1775, was 80 years old. And he was sort of a model loyal British patriot in America. He had served twice alongside redcoats, fighting for king and country in King George's War and then in the French and Indian War. But like many of his neighbors, he was aghast at what he saw as British policies that were trampling upon Americans' rights. And he knew, he received word, as others did, from Paul Revere and the other riders who went out into the countryside announcing that the redcoats were coming. And when they were marching back from Concord past his house in what is today Arlington, Massachusetts, he was ready. So he had a musket, he had 2 pistols, and he had a sword that he had taken from the body of a French officer whom he had slain at the fortress of Louisbourg in Nova Scotia during the French and Indian War. And he was behind his stone fence. And as the British marched down the road in front of his house, he aimed, and I could picture his 80-year-old hands maybe quivering just a bit. He aimed his musket and shot in their direction, and boom, down went one redcoat. And then he reloaded and he aimed again and fired it again, and boom, down went another redcoat. Finally, the British saw where these shots were coming from. Maybe they saw a poof of white hair above the stone fence, and they sent a detachment of men to take him out. He discharged his pistols and downed a third redcoat. Then he is flailing about with his sword while they stabbed him with their bayonets 13 times, shot him in the face, and left him for dead. But guess what, Jeff? Samuel Whitmore, the 80-year-old man who was left for dead, doesn't die. He lives for another 18 years to die a 98-year-old citizen of a free and independent United States. It's just a fantastic story.
That is actually amazing, and the shift in his mind from being a British subject and thinking of himself as British to thinking of himself as American, as an 80-year-old guy, to really take up arms in that very first battle is amazing to me. That tells me that the American mind really had been formed and kind of cemented in a lot of people by the time you get to 1775, right? But as you said, sometimes we think then the first shot begins independence, but there's resistance, as you put it, and then there's revolution, which doesn't really take place until July of 1776 with independence. Remind us, what are a couple of the important events between those battles in 1775 and 1776 that really convince Americans, okay, now we have to have independence?
I mean, there are a couple of things. I mean, one is the fact that war has begun. American blood is being spilled. It seems as if our lives and our liberty and our property and our safety and our happiness are all imperiled. And you begin to see the Continental Congress moving to a wartime footing. They establish the Continental Army. They select George Washington, a delegate from Virginia, as the commander in chief. They publish, written by both Thomas Jefferson, who is sort of on the radical side of the independence question, as well as John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who is much more moderate and really hopes to find some opportunity for conciliation. They write the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of taking up arms in the summer of 1775, sort of rattling the sword, but at the same time, they pass the Olive Branch Petition, a last-ditch effort to air their grievances with the king. They direct this at the king directly. They assure him of their loyalty so long as he upholds their rights. The war continues to rage on. More blood is spilled. In January of 1776, Thomas Paine publishes Common Sense. There are 100,000 copies of Common Sense published just in the first 3 months. And this is in a nation of about 3 million people. So these ideas are out there, they're multiplying. And you see people rallying around the cause. One of my favorite documents in the collection is a newspaper account of a group of 170 women in my hometown, Stratford, Connecticut, where I grew up. They formed what they called a petticoat army, and they marched upon the house of a couple named William and Mary Edwards. And the Edwardses had recently named their son Thomas Gage in honor of the British general who had been in charge in Boston. So they're loyalists, and it kind of makes sense that they're loyalists because in this Congregationalist New England town, the Edwardses are Anglicans. They're members of the Church of England. And anyway, the women elected officers, their general was a woman named Elizabeth Judson Whiting, whose husband, Samuel Whiting, was the colonel in charge of the local militia. They announced their intention to fit Mrs. Edwards with a suit of tar and feathers. But when they got to the house, they were greeted by Mr. Edwards at the door. He sort of talked them down. He must have said something. His words are lost to history, but he must have said something that diffused the situation because they didn't commit any act of violence against the Edwardses. But, this large group of women showing the solidarity of the people of Stratford around this cause of resistance I think really made an impression on the Edwardses, because in a couple of years, his name, William Edwards's name, shows up on the muster rolls of the Connecticut militia. So he is no longer a loyalist. He is now a patriot. And in some ways, these women showed great strength, but in other respects, they showed great restraint. And I think that was one of the secrets of the success of the resistance movement to British authority. After the Boston Tea Party, for example, the three ships that were docked in Boston Harbor, the Eleanor, the Dartmouth, and the Beaver, the people who dumped the tea into the harbor had to smash open the cargo hold. So they had to break the padlocks of the masters of these vessels. But the next day, after dumping the tea in the harbor, with great ceremony, they presented the masters of these vessels with new padlocks, trying to make the point that their violence was, laser focused, that it was targeted, that they weren't indiscriminately destroying other people's property, that they were acting out of principle and using the greatest degree of restraint possible. So I think things like that won people over, not just the ideas of the American Revolution, but the behavior of the American revolutionaries.
Yeah, that's a really important point. One of the questions it always raises in my mind, and maybe we're seeing a bit of it on the streets today in America. Some people are likening the activities of people out there indiscriminately pulling down historical statues, for example. They're calling them Jacobins, and Jacobinism, the French Revolution. Can you say a little bit more about the American Revolution? To me, seems unique in sort of that kind of restraint, or it's maybe it's the only revolution in modern times that doesn't lead to a bloody terror. We think of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, the French Revolution, you name a revolution, and it always ends in some kind of terror and usually dictatorship. The American Revolution doesn't. Why not?
It's a great question, and it's a classic question. When I teach the American Revolution course for Ashland, I always begin with sort of the classic question: how revolutionary was the American Revolution? In other words, was the American Revolution essentially a conservative movement designed to restore the rights and liberties that colonists had enjoyed during the period of benign neglect before the French and Indian War? Or instead, was it a radical movement designed to expand rights not only to the people who had traditionally enjoyed them, but women and African Americans and religious minorities? And, like any good question, the answer is probably a little bit of both. But I think maybe the word revolution itself offers us a clue about the ambiguity here, because the Glorious Revolution, which we've referred to, England's restoration of a balanced constitution in 1688 and 1689, was sort of understood as a circular orbit. You go from point A, where things are good, to point B, where things are bad, and you have the revolution and return to point A. So it was, in a sense, a conservative revolution. The French Revolution, of course, is not designed to restore anything. It's designed as a break with the past. You want to go from point A, which is an absolute monarch, to point B, which is, in theory at least, liberty and fraternity and equality. But we know that the reality of the French Revolution was different. And unfortunately for the French, it spun out of control. And in terms of the model that it might follow, it really was a circular revolution where you go from King Louis the whatever. I mean, when you're counting your King Louis in the teens, you've got an authoritarian monarchy on your hands.
Line. Yeah, that's right.
It's a long line. And you go from him to liberty and fraternity and equality, but from there to the Committee of Safety and the Reign of Terror, and you end up with another absolutist, with Emperor Napoleon. So the French Revolution, I think, is very much a revolution that failed. Whereas the American Revolution, I think, because of its moderation, as well as the fact that people really sincerely did care about the principles they advocated and expanding and applying universally, but gradually, the principles that they advocated, the American Revolution survived to eventually fully succeed.
All right. And what about the role of important leaders in the American Revolution? People like George Washington. So one of the documents you had us look at was about the Newburgh Conspiracy. at the end of the War of Independence itself. And there's this wonderful line that's attributed at least to Charles de Gaulle, who says the graveyards are full of indispensable men. But George Washington was at least considered by his contemporaries as indispensable. And I just wonder if the success of the American Revolution, how much does it have to do with George Washington's leadership? What kind of leader was he militarily? And what do we see in this thing called the Newburgh Conspiracy, which maybe not all of us are familiar with?
So yeah, let's start at the end of the story, the Newburgh Conspiracy. I mean, this was a remarkable moment. Essentially, the Newburgh Conspiracy took place after America's great victory at Yorktown, when General Lafayette alerted Washington, whose forces were up near New York City, that Lord Cornwallis had withdrawn British forces to the Yorktown Peninsula in Virginia. And as a civilian who teaches at West Point, Jeff, I try not to dispense military advice to my students, but one piece of advice I'm very comfortable giving to them is don't retreat to a peninsula. It's just a bad idea. So Cornwallis goes to this
Right.
Yorktown Peninsula, and Lafayette, gets word of this. He sends word up to Washington, who, with French General Rochambeau, they march their combined forces down from the outskirts of New York to surround Cornwallis by land. Meanwhile, fortunately, the French Admiral de Grasse has defeated the British on the high seas. He surrounds them by sea. And, during the siege of Yorktown, eventually Cornwallis will surrender. And once that happens, people realize that the British probably have lost their will to fight. And peace negotiations begin in earnest. But we can't release the army because then our peace negotiators will lose all leverage. So Washington moves the army just north of West Point on the Hudson River in New York. The Hudson River, of course, was considered to be very strategically important, especially because the British had forces in New York City as well as in Canada. So it blocked their, free communication. And, when armies are not fighting and when they're not training, they're good at really complaining. And these soldiers and these officers had a lot about which they could complain. Some of them had not been paid literally in years. Many hadn't been paid in months. During the course of the American Revolution, there was runaway inflation. So the salaries under which they had enlisted were almost reduced to nothing. And many of them started to say, once peace happens, we'll lose all leverage vis-a-vis the Continental Congress, and we'll be abandoned, and they'll never make good on their debts to us. Some were calling for, half pay for life. Some wanted land in the West as compensation for their services. And they called a meeting where they were, going to not only complain, but also consider what they might possibly do. And there were some crazy ideas out there. Some people floated the idea of marching with their weapons drawn on the Continental Congress and forcing Congress to meet their demands. Others contemplated marching the army west and leaving the United States undefended. When Washington got whiff of this, he realized that this conspiracy possessed the potential to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And he appeared before the men. He reached into his pocket to read a letter that he had written to a member of the Continental Congress, reminding Congress of the needs of his officers and soldiers. But as he did this, he squinted down on the page and he reached into his pocket and he pulled out a pair of glasses. And in the 18th century, glasses were considered a sign of infirmity and old age. And so this really was kind of an affecting spectacle of Washington putting on his spectacles. Only his closest aides had seen him wearing them before. But he said, "You will excuse me, gentlemen, for I have grown not only gray, but also nearly blind in your service." And at that moment, in the eyes of the men who were present, never before did George Washington seem so big, and never before had they felt so small. And these battle-hardened veterans of the American Revolution, many of them began to sob. They were so embarrassed by what they had contemplated. Here was George Washington, a man who had served without pay for the entirety of the Revolution. Here was George Washington, a man who had literally had horses shot out from under him, who had exposed himself to every hardship, who had exposed himself to every danger, it to the extent that there ever really was a Newburgh conspiracy, to the extent that there ever was a serious threat that it would be acted upon, at that moment, right then and right there, it evaporated. And it's not just that George Washington was able to restrain his own men and their own desire for power. It's that he was able to restrain himself. There was an American artist in London named Benjamin West who reported that he had a conversation with the king. He was painting portraits for the royal family. And the king asked him, he said, "Is it true what I hear about George Washington, that if the war ends, he will return to private life?" I mean, the king was incredulous because victorious generals never did that. They always retained power. They frequently became military dictators. But Benjamin West said, yes, that is what people understand, that he will return to his farm and his family at Mount Vernon. And the king supposedly in that moment said, well, if he does that, then he is truly the greatest character of the age. And that's exactly what George Washington did.
So in that respect, he really was the indispensable man.
I think he was. And, if you would like to talk about the war itself and his military strategy, we can. He had this view that the British needed somehow to win this war. He understood, conversely, that Americans merely had to avoid losing this war. And so, to avoid losing this war, we had to avoid seeing the Continental Army captured. We needed to keep this army in the field, to keep it viable. He thought that time was on our side. So, he was very careful about choosing his battles. He didn't want to expose the army to undue risk or danger. He always wanted to have a path open for the possibility of retreat. And he understood that as time passed, the American people, as a result of the actions taken by the British Army and their very heavy handed approach toward American civilians, he understood that the American people, as time passed, would increasingly see the British Army as them and the Continental Army as us. I mean, we should realize that at the beginning of 1776, at least, John Adams estimated that you could divide the American people into thirds. One third were patriots who supported independence. One third were loyalists who wanted to remain with the king. And another third were sort of in the middle. They were sitting on the fence. But as time passed, more and more people began to see the British as the enemy, in part because of their very heavy-handed treatment of the American population. The British, they needed to win not only battles and territory, but they needed to win hearts and minds, truly. And the longer the war dragged on, the more they ended up alienating the American populace.
So by the time we get to the end of the Revolution and Washington handing back his power, which I think has become so famous at the time that it's actually in the rotunda of the Capitol, there's a painting of that happening, was so significant in American history. The disputes we hear today among historians, but now just out in the general public, and we're hearing a lot, is okay, that's all great, but the American Revolution had no real significance or importance past the 1783. That it had grand ideals, perhaps, but all of those ideals were betrayed or fell short. That it had no real long effect in American history. So you're a historian of American history. Tell us, is that right, or did the Revolution and its principles, the kind of thing we see and remember from the Declaration of Independence, was it looked back to as an inspiration for the country, including on issues like race and slavery?
Mm-hmm. I think it really was an inspiration, and I think that you could trace a clear path from 1776 to the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. When Thomas Jefferson wrote in his draft of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, it's clear from his draft of the Declaration that when he wrote all men, he meant all mankind. It's clear because he included in his draft a passage blaming the king on the international slave trade, which he thought was treason against the hopes of the world, and a grave inhumanity toward a distant people who he wrote had never offended us. So it's clear that he included Africans and African Americans among, the members of mankind who bore these inalienable rights. But it's also clear that he understood just how embedded slavery was in American society. And not just American society. I mean, slavery had existed pretty much everywhere at all time in one shape or form. And it's really the revolutionary generation that is first to question it. And not surprisingly, and you begin to see the fruits of that questioning unfold and flower in the years immediately after independence. Vermont, in its 1777 Constitution, bans slavery. Massachusetts, in a 1783 state Supreme Court decision, is going to ban slavery. New Hampshire is putting slavery on the path to extinction by the 1780s. Connecticut and Rhode Island passed bills for gradual emancipation in 1784. Pennsylvania does in 1790. New York follows suit. Jefferson, as governor of Virginia in 1779, proposes a bill for gradual emancipation in Virginia. Now, sadly, that doesn't pass. And if it did, you could imagine just how different the future would have been. You could also imagine just how different the future would have been if Jefferson, as a member of Congress in 1784, had succeeded in passing the Ordinance of 1784, which would have prohibited the spread of slavery to all of the land that was recognized as American territory in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which brought the War for Independence to a close. In all of that land, from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, in all of that land, from the Great Lakes almost all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, slavery would have been banned. And unfortunately, it failed by one vote. But 3 years later, the Northwest Ordinance was passed, drawing the line at the Ohio River. So slavery was prohibited north of the Ohio. Jefferson, as president in 1808, at the first constitutionally allowable moment, signed the bill that ended the international slave trade. And so the revolutionary generation, I mean, we all wish that they could have done more, but they certainly did a lot, and they did a lot more than any generation that had preceded them. And they did a lot more, sadly, than the generation that followed them. Because when you get into the 1820s and the 1830s, opinions about slavery harden. And while you begin to see the emergence of abolitionism in the North, you also begin to see in the South the emergence of pro-slavery thought. And it's really those two very distinct beliefs about slavery that are going to lead to the Civil War and this horrible conflict that is going to lead to the ending of 750,000 Americans' lives. So we know that it was an incomplete revolution, but it was one that extended far beyond the question of who should rule at home, to include larger questions of how do we as human beings relate to one another? How do we as human beings regard one another? And what does it mean to be an American, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of religion?
Wow, you do see some of that, even personally. Again, in a person I'm thinking of, like George Washington, for example. It's not often told these days. In fact, sadly, I saw a statue of George Washington pulled down last month. But historically ignorant people who don't even know that George Washington himself freed his slaves upon the death of his wife. Is a complicated legal situation, but he even said in his last will and testament that it was earnestly wished by him that he could free his slaves during his own life. Mm-hmm. So I think that's not a part of the American Revolutionary story that we often hear very, very much.
It isn't. And, I think that's a great example of a fact that I think history can teach all of us. I don't know about you. I assume that it's the same for you. For me, history makes me humble. And history makes me humble about the present, and our present circumstances. I mean, we are all imperfect people. We live in an imperfect and complicated world. I think one reason why George Washington didn't contemplate freeing his slaves during his own lifetime was because slavery wasn't the only issue that he was trying to advance. We take for granted the durability of this truly fragile experiment that was the United States of America. And Washington understood quite well. And, certainly you see this playing out in the years of the early republic. The American Union was a very delicate thing. I mean, at the moment of our birth, when Jefferson's anti-slave trade provision was read before the Continental Congress, the delegates of Georgia and South Carolina said, if this thing stays in the Declaration of Independence, you could count us out. So at the moment of America's birth, slavery possessed the potential to lead to the dissolution of the United States. And, when Jefferson was leading his Republican Party in the 1790s, he thought that the unity of America was imperiled at the hands of Federalists. He can't make an issue out of slavery, especially when you consider that the bulk of his support comes from the American South. Washington understood that making too big of an issue out of slavery would have led, had the potential at least to lead to the dissolution of the Union. So they're trying to balance these competing priorities. And, I think maybe sadly, they didn't put more emphasis on ending slavery, but they fought the battles that they thought that they could win. And on the issue of slavery, best given the circumstances with which they were confronted, leaving that to another day, leaving that to another generation.
Yeah, as Abraham Lincoln said, the founders put slavery on the path toward ultimate extinction, but that the next generations, it would be their responsibility to take that up. But that they all viewed slavery as, if it may be necessary to tolerate, but as a necessary evil, as Lincoln put it.
In the 18th century, that was the predominant view in the South, certainly. But it's worth noting that Abraham Lincoln, of course, resorted to the Declaration of Independence to make his points against slavery, as did Frederick Douglass, as did Martin Luther King. So for the people today who somehow want to discredit the American Revolution, I think that ultimately it's self-defeating for them and their cause, and it's impoverishing for America and its history. Because if you care about civil rights, if you care about equality, if you care about people being able to live together in peace with respect to each other's rights, the American Revolution is, I think, one of the most solid foundations on which you can build.
Wow, that's a great way to end this. Time has just flown by, Rob. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. I know you're heading back to West Point in the cadets sometime in early August. Is that right?
That's right. Yes.
Great. Well, they are blessed to have such a wonderful professor and an insightful historian as you to teach them. We're so thankful for your work with them and with our military leaders there, and also with our teachers in our master's program and our Teaching American History program. So thank you so much for joining us. Really do appreciate that.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, great. Thanks again. And folks, if you want to order a copy of Rob's book, this new Ashbrook volume in our core documents collection, please send me a note, send us a note at Ashbrook, and we will make sure that we get it. It's a wonderful collection for you, for your friends, for your children, for your grandchildren, for teachers we want to get it out. I have to say that this has been, the American Revolution volume has been the largest selling volume of pre-sales for any book that Ashbrook has ever published. So that tells me either Rob Mcdonald's really famous, or or there's a real hunger out there among teachers and students for knowledge and insight in the American Revolution. And it's needed now more than ever. So please order those volumes, and we want to complete this collection. So I know I'm talking here to Directors Club members who are supporters of the center. Consider, if you wouldn't, for a moment, to sponsor one of these volumes. You can talk to myself or Sally Schramm, our Director of Development, about how we can do that. We want to complete this 45-volume set and get this in the hands of students and teachers and citizens across the country. That's our goal here, to provide the kind of solid history that we talked about today. And I hope you take some insight and inspiration from today's webinar. I was thinking about this. One of the documents from that era, from December of 1776, was a famous writing by Thomas Paine called The Crisis. And these are familiar words, I think, but I thought I'd close with these, as they're so appropriate for our time today. Paine writes, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sometime patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." So we want to thank you for standing by us at the Ashbrook Center in our mission. We want to thank you for your support of us and our work on behalf of the country. We really believe that America needs Ashbrook now more than ever. We want to thank you for your involvement and support of us in that. We really believe, when you hear this, how much the good work that people like Rob out there are doing with teachers. There really is hope for the country. So as always, in these troubled times, difficult times, please stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay connected with Ashbrook. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you again.
Thanks again for listening. Remember, you can download a free PDF copy of this reader at tah.org/collections or purchase a physical copy at tah.org/bookstore.